Hi, and welcome to this session of Create Good 2020. Today we have Taylor Maxwell from Everytown for gun safety, and she is going to share a little bit about media big and small, how to activate them all. Take it away, Taylor.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to talk with y'all today. Hi, I am Taylor Maxwell. As Dawn said, I'm the Communications Director for Everytown's grassroots brands, Moms Demand Action and Students Demand Action. And before coming to Everytown, I worked in communications on environmental, reproductive work, transit, and a lot of issues in the consulting world. Everytown was originally my client, and I fell in love with the work and the people there. And so I've been full-time for about 4.5 years there, but I've been working on the issue for over 6. I'm originally from NC, so I wish I were there with y'all this week. And contact info is at the bottom of this, but it's also at the end of the slides. Okay, so this is what we'll be talking about today. So the formula for how to make your pitch successful, which is pretty tough, particularly in our current environment. Some common pitfalls that I have made myself and hopefully learned from at this point. And then how you can work with your volunteer base if you are at an organization that has one, and leverage the power of those volunteers to get more media attention. Okay, so how many communication staffers are there per reporter? So reporters are greatly outnumbered. We outnumber reporters by about a 10-to-1 ratio. And it is really important when you're doing reporter outreach to not do blind blast as much as you can and to become a trusted source. So for me and for the work that I do, I will sometimes send releases, of course, to a big list, but I would never send a pitch note and just like BCC a ton of folks. I would always do strategic outreach to a few folks. And typically that's more successful than casting a wide net. So to formulate a good pitch, so first you need a good media list. So that means finding out who is writing on your issue, using Google Alerts. I do a lot of searching. I do searching at specific outlets that I want to cover my issue. I want to find out as much as possible how I can get the right people on my list. And I also use Twitter a lot. So Twitter is one of my best friends when it comes to building a media list. I want to know reporters who have been talking about my topic, and I've done a lot of advanced searches on Twitter to figure that out. Be selective with your outreach. So the longer you are in this media world, the more you will make over time some high value contacts. When you have those reporter contacts that you really value and really appreciate, don't put them on like a blast email that goes wide. Make sure that you're being strategic, showing that you value those relationships and not overdoing it. And finally, it's about the pitch. So how can we write the sharpest possible pitch that will really break through and hopefully help get your story told? Okay, so what makes an event or story pitchable? So first of all, it's a question of, is there a story to tell? Oh my goodness, every time I move that, I'm sorry y'all, 1 second. There we go. Learning as we go. Oh no, I did it again. Okay, there we go. So what is the story to tell? So how does what you pitch contribute to the narrative? So for the issue that I work on, gun safety, obviously right now, everything is rightly about coronavirus and its effects on communities. But what you might not know is that gun violence and coronavirus have a lot of intersections. So for us, anything we're pitching right now is talking about both issues together. It's also about the strong voices that you have. So before I pitch anything to the press, I want to know who I have available who can talk to them about it. So whether that's an expert or a media trained volunteer, I want to make sure that there's someone who has a compelling story that potentially makes my pitch more valuable. And then finally for events, we at Moms Demand Action pride ourselves on our signature red t-shirts. And I'm always thinking about the visuals of an event. So of course the branding Is the crowd representative of the movement that you want to be? So are you an organization of mothers like we are? Do you want to make sure that the photos and the visuals that you're including are friendly for partners? Are there partners that you can include that show a broader, more powerful picture? And finally, is there a larger crowd? So if you're talking about an event, you want to know roughly how many people are there so that you never send a TV camera into a relatively empty room. Choosing your speakers. So obviously, Sean Spicer was not a good choice as a speaker to press because he got really angry at the press all the time. You want someone who's going to be really calm and really sensitive to the audience that they're talking to and stay on message and never feel angry or uncomfortable about that. So figure out who's going to tell the story most authentically, find speakers that have relevant background, as I said, and then the other question is this something that's actually high value? So for the organization that I work for, we have a few volunteers who have done a ton of media. They're incredibly well trained. And sometimes I want to use those voices. And other times I decide to give an opportunity to a volunteer who's never done press before because the volunteer is fairly low stakes. The interview is fairly low stakes. It's a friendly reporter. And the most important thing that I can do is to broaden who is able to talk to media to make sure that we have a diverse movement that's representative of the issue that I work on. And so whenever I can, it's about giving a new voice the opportunity to. Okay, so what's the headline? So this is something that I always think about before I pitch is if I had to sum what I'm talking about into one sentence, what is that one sentence? If you're not doing what we're doing here, gun control group Everytown to spend $8 million in Texas races, it's unlikely that your brand is going to be in the headline and unlikely that your brand is actually the news. So as much as you can, try to move what you're doing into a broader topic that you'll be able to hopefully pitch pegged to something else. So this is an example of a pitch and this is like how I typically format pitches. So first, of course, the subject line. I always think about the subject line before anything else. I see that as hopefully the headline of the piece. And I want to be really clear about what I'm trying to get out of this for folks. So the most interesting thing in this pitch to a Tennessee reporter is probably that there's law enforcement and gun safety activists working together. So I want to be clear about that in the subject line. I always bold what's most important to me. So I bold here that we've done 3,000 calls and a petition of more than 5,000 signatures. I hope it's clear by the names that I made up most of this pitch. There is, in fact, a permitless carry fight in Tennessee, but the petition and calls are not numbers approved by my digital team. That is just for this example. So I would bold that, and then finally just have those names really clear. So when you go to talk to a reporter and email them, make sure you know who are the people that they can talk to. And if they're compelling voices, you want to include that in the pitch. And then the last thing I always try to include is some more resources if reporters do want that. So in this case, I link, if you could see the link, I would show you that I'm linking to a fact sheet that we have on permitless carry. Okay, so once you've hit send, this is a pet peeve of mine and something that I think people probably do fairly often when you're busy and trying to pitch a lot of things at once. It's easy to hit send and feel like you're done and you've done the pitch and just wait for the responses to come in. I am a big fan of calling reporters, and there's like times to do that, so it's best because it is annoying for people and you have to be cognizant of that. You do not want to annoy people that you need regularly, and you don't want them to ask you to stop calling them. So to prevent that, you can be strategic with when you call and when you follow up. For local TV, I really like to call early morning. I try to call between 6:30 and 7:30 a.m. if I want to reach a local assignment desk. I want to get to them before their morning meeting if the event's that day, so that they can pitch it in their morning meeting. And because I like to be really thorough, I call again after their morning meeting and hope they have an answer for me on whether or not they're going to come to my event. A print reporter, it depends on the story. So here I say that you can send a follow-up note 24 hours later, but you can also call, and there's hours that are best to do that too. So this is 10:30 to 2 p.m. is like the standard safe-ish hours to call a print reporter, but feel free to do that at your own discretion. And also, of course, if you have a deadline that's really pressing, of course, feel free to call like immediately after you send a pitch. I have done that before. It's not a great way to make friends, but people understand if it's a good story that, or something that's moving quickly, that you do need to get the voice out there quickly. And then the last thing is that when you are on text basis with a reporter, then that's like the easiest, best thing. It's fast for everyone. And I found that to be really effective. So I typically try to get to reporters over the phone enough times that they've saved my number and that it's okay if I text them. So I will do that pretty regularly these days. Okay, so I would love your thoughts on these headlines. So based on what you know about what kind of pitches work, I would love to talk about these headlines and understand a bit of why these headlines work. So let's see. So gun safety groups beat the NRA and in Virginia, next stop Texas. So that was a pitch that we did around the NRA having been defeated wholeheartedly in the 2019 elections in Virginia. And we were coming to Texas next, and we were announcing the big spend there. So we were able to get that. This last example here of the 3 freshmen that start a chapter of Students Demand Action, I think is a really great way of localizing a story. So are those 3, is that like a national Students Demand Action play? No, but it feels really localized, and sometimes even something that small can be a story if you reach the right outlet. Any questions about pitching before I go any further?
So there's a question from Andrea. Do you find Twitter useful for DMing reporters, or do they typically not respond well to that?
I have found it to be really useful, but I only do it in response to stories that they've already written. So I won't blindly DM a reporter off of like a hunch that they might be interested in something. But if a reporter just tweeted about an issue and my issue is related to that, I have successfully over DM said, hey, like saw that you just tweeted about this. We're actually doing this other thing this week or have this news coming out. Would you be interested in covering that? And that's been successful before. The other big way I've made friends that's sort of related is through corrections. I work for an organization that's often mischaracterized, and reaching out to reporters to set the record straight, asking for slight updates to stories that for accuracy reasons that then reporters see are like is the right thing to do, has actually become a really good way for me to make friends.
Okay. So let's see. Claire says that she has trouble getting reporters interested in good news stories. What advice do you have for that?
That's a great question. Good news is really hard. I actually think that's easier right now than it usually is because everyone is so hungry for good news right now. And so at least in my world of gun safety work, stories that have a positive spin are much more popular right now. Generally for good news stories, I would go to second, like outlets like for what I do, Refinery 29, Bustle, Mommy blogs, outlets that are more willing to have a hopeful stance. Places like People magazine seem to be a better place for that, but definitely like a good news story, if you're looking for like a New York Times or Vox or something like that, I think you probably need to have a pretty hefty set of data to visually show the good news for them to be able to take that story.
Okay. Great. And then we'll do this one last question and then we'll move on. We'll have more time for questions later. This question is from Caitlin. Do you communicate on social media versus your organization's account, or do you use your personal one?
So we have a full social media team and a lot of volunteer support on that too. So I use my personal Twitter. I follow reporters on Twitter. They mostly follow me back when I'm able to tag them. And so if I work with a reporter on a story, I'll tweet that story that I worked on and tag them in the tweet. And that often means that they follow me back, and then we have more interactions on Twitter afterwards.
Okie dokie, great. If you want to keep going, we'll have more questions later.
Great. And I apologize if folks can hear my dogs outside, the work from home life. So common pitfalls. So there are some simple things that folks often get wrong in pitching. A few of these we've talked about before, but the first one particularly. So casting too wide of a net is a really common error. It's something that I've seen groups that have worked with us do. I've seen our own consultants sometimes do, that they're really hungry for a story, and there's a sense of desperation to try to get something out there. And so we reach too big rather than being smart. And so I would always lean towards a smart pitch over a blind email. Second is a cultural thing that I hope folks don't relate to in their organizations, but it seems to be a common issue that communications teams are not necessarily in the loop early enough. So one of the easiest, although also sometimes most difficult things to do, is actually addressing the structure of where you work, to try to make sure that communication staff is looped early enough so that if you have a report coming out, if you have some news that you can make, trying to do it in a way that will actually allow a story to be placed off of it. So as much as you can, try to help your team to help themselves by bringing comms into it early. Finally, don't skimp on relationship building. So a lot of the reporters that I work with regularly are reporters that I've asked for coffee, that even virtually have come to Zooms that we've done. And that sort of relationship building has been really helpful in building a relationship that gets a lot of stories in the long run. So that's a little tricky right now, obviously, where everyone's at home, but it also means that people have more time. I did a Google Hangout with a New York Times Magazine writer a few weeks ago that was actually really helpful. And I think hopefully has a story coming out of it. So even virtually, I think it's worth asking if folks want to spend 30 minutes talking about your issue. If you have a shiny person as part of your organization, and by that I mean a leader that really might interest that reporter, feel free to ask that person to get coffee with the reporter with you, so that maybe meeting that person can be the thing that helps build that relationship for you. Okay, building relationships. So yeah, use social media. Don't be a robot. It's easy to just I think it's better on social media when you sound like yourself. So ideally you are tweeting when you don't have to tweet about work. You have a personality on Twitter just like you do in real life. And hopefully that means that the person that you're trying to connect with knows who you are and hopefully likes you and is able to work with you. Reach out only when you have something genuinely interesting to them. That's a key factor. And then if this is a reach relationship, make sure that you are reading their pieces and connecting in follow-up to their reporting. So if it's like a Nick Kristof, for example, I wouldn't necessarily start with a blind email. I would start by reading a lot of his pieces, understanding what he's working on, and then reaching out in response to something that he just wrote that you think you might have something to add to or something relevant to that. And finally, one thing that Everytown does that I think is really useful and a little different is that we send a lot of notes to media. And you can see this on everytown.org/press. We we'll very regularly just send notes out to our list with context on how you should view an issue. So that means that a bill just went through in the state house in Ohio. And the way we'll of course put out a statement on that, but we'll also put out a note to media compiling coverage that we thought was fair with quotes from experts. So if it's a dangerous bill, we might quote a law enforcement officer talking about how that bill will make their job more difficult, as well as the survivor of gun violence, for example. But we try to pull not just statements out, but also context that can build a narrative around a story or an issue. And notes to media has been really helpful for that. It's not a way to pitch and like immediately get a story, but if you're trying to shape coverage, it's a good way to do that. Okay, so what other issues have you faced in trying to get a story out? I would love to hear from a few folks here as well. And are there other common pitfalls that we should address?
Okay, great. So you can ask your questions while we're waiting for those questions to come up. I do have one from Mario. It says, do you find that similar to social media, do you have to reach out fairly often to reporters before you see any visible results, or is it just a matter of timing?
I think it depends on what you're pitching and if you're able to get any face time. So one thing that I used to do, which again, it's always going to depend on the issue you're working on, but so I used to manage communications for the Midwest states for Everytown. And as part of that, I was able to travel to a lot of state houses in the Midwest, and I would always pull a volunteer or a survivor of gun violence with me and go into the media, into the room where all the media worked in the state house. Once I did an in-person and folks felt like I was more than, one of the 10 reporter or 10 PR people reaching out to them every day, or hundreds sometimes, it's been a lot more successful. I think that it's important to keep reaching out. Certainly I've had reporters respond to my fourth or fifth email. I would say typically if you're reaching out every other day, that's not a crazy aggressive outreach. But certainly I would mix it up. I would think about if someone's not responding to you, there's probably a reason that story isn't right for them. It's probably not that they haven't seen your email.
That's a good point. Okay, great. So we have a question again from Caitlin, and advice on pitching policy-related things. Our work is long-term and behind the scenes, but the huge real-world impact eventually. So, what about those long-term, hard, the long cons, right? In the best way.
Yeah, we do that. We do that too. So two things I would say. So the first is timing of when your long piece is going to come out. So if you have, for example, I think it was last year or the year prior, we had a report coming out on disrupting firearm access, and because firearm access leads to higher suicide rates. So we put that out in Suicide Prevention Month alongside partners in that group, in that area, and that made it more successful. So if you can peg off of something that's already making news, like kids are going back to school, and because of that, you're putting out a report that's tied to this thing that news outlets are already covering, that certainly helps. I think, again, part of that challenge is making sure that comms is in the loop early enough that you're able to actually give that feedback and make sure that the timing of something is going to work. The other thing I would say is stories. So any research or reports that we put out include stories of gun violence survivors who illustrate the point that we're making and the urgency of it. So for us, it's always survivor stories, but depending on what you do, I would just always think about photos and about the stories that you can tell of how the long-winding report that you're working on is actually affecting a lot of people. So that's what I would say. Okay. Does anyone have pitfalls that we're missing on this list, or any pitfalls that folks have experienced in trying to get a story?
Mario has raised his hand, so let's see. I'm going to try this. We'll see how this goes.
Okay.
Okay, raised hand. Go.
Hi, everyone. Hopefully this is working and you can hear me okay.
It is.
Wonderful. Yeah, I thought I would ask this verbally instead. with respect to building relationships, I was curious. So we have a small team of 5 in communications, but I'm the main person in charge of media, social media, marketing. There's just a lot given that it's a nonprofit. And I'm curious, what do you think? Do you think we should be separating a personal account and company account for certain aspects of said communications? And are you using any tools at all for gathering metrics, analytics, or automation that has helped you in building relationships and sort of putting your stories out? Thank you.
Yeah. So I have looked into a lot of tools. There's one called Close that I've looked into with a Z that I've looked into before. That's relationship building software and remembering to reach out to people regularly. Frankly, I'm always too busy to remember to use it. So that hasn't worked well for me. The thing I would say about like personal versus brand accounts is that a brand account is generally going to be less popular than a voice that actually has a face to it, right? So at Moms Demand Action, the founder of Moms Demand Action, Shannon Watts, always has more Twitter followers than the brand itself. And it's not a fault of the brand, it's what happens when you have a real personality on Twitter that has a face and isn't just an icon with a logo on it. So I think there's value in that. I think there's value in getting reporters to know who you are a bit. You'll stand out more in their inbox if they're more comfortable hearing your name and recognizing it. Okay, let's move on. So the last piece I wanted to talk about is working with volunteers. So at Moms Demand Action and Everytown for Gun Safety, we have a lot of volunteers. This is a movement that started at Shannon Watts' kitchen table the day after Sandy Hook, and she was devastated and wanted to know where there was a group like Mothers Against Drunk Driving for gun safety. She couldn't find one, and so she decided to start her own. And Moms Demand Action began with mostly women at their kitchen tables, quickly on Skype calls and that sort of stuff across the country, trying to figure out how to start a movement. That quickly turned into people reaching out to Shannon and saying, hey, I want to start a chapter of Moms Demand Action where I am. How can I do that? And her response would be, a chapter of what? Because it was so new that she didn't quite realize what she had yet. So what that means for our organization is that we have the really good fortune of having thousands of volunteers who feel incredibly connected to this work and do it day in and day out, just like those of us who work here do. It's a really humbling piece of the work for me that so many of the volunteers I work with have been doing this longer than I've been doing it, and I've been doing it a while, and they are really experts in their communities. So if you are training a volunteer to do media, if you are working with volunteers and have the privilege to do that, then the first thing I would just say is to make sure that you recognize that they are really experts too. They're the ones that have lived experience that I don't necessarily get from, although I got it when I lived in North Carolina, I don't get it as much here in where I live now in DC and then New York. My life is a bit different than it was when I lived in a more rural area. So that would be the first thing I would say. The second is organize yourself out of a job. So one of the things that I've really focused on as communications director for our grassroots is to train our grassroots not just to do media, but also to pitch media. So we actually train our volunteers on how to build media lists, on how to pitch stories, how to build relationships with reporters. I have some agita about this because I wish that I could be in the weeds on everything at all times and know everything that's going out the door. But at some point, you just have to trust that the volunteers are experts too. You trained them and they're going to do great. And 99% of the time they do. And a lot of the stories that you see about Moms Demand Action were not pitched by me or anyone on my team. They were pitched by people who are volunteering their time to talk about gun safety, and that's an incredible thing. The third thing I would say is give them resources. So whether that's talking points, which we do a lot of, and there's a document that Dawn dropped in the chat function that is the template that we use that I'll talk about in a second. And then communications tactics. So these are both documents that we give to our volunteers, and I'll talk about more. But to give them talking points, give them briefings. So at the start of every legislative session, basically everyone at Everytown that works on a state will hold a call with the volunteer leaders in that state, and we will give them everything we know about what we think is going to happen in that state, the bills that we think we can get through, and anything we know might be coming from the other side that we'll need to fight against. So we'll tell them in Arkansas that there's a stand your ground bill that we think is going to pop this year. We're going to be really careful. We're going to let you know how we think we can best fight it, that sort of stuff. And then ask for feedback is another really key piece, because often they have a lot to teach you. So this is just a story to talk about how amazing volunteers are. So I met Lucy McBath in 2013. Her son, Jordan Davis, was shot and killed, sometimes on CNN called the loud music shooting, but he was a young Black man shot and killed by an angry white man who thought his music was too loud. And I met Lucy about 3 months after that because she wanted to make a difference and volunteer response demand action. And for about 2 years, she was a spokesperson for us as a volunteer. Sometimes traveling the country, she was still a Delta flight attendant. And she would tell her story, and she was incredible. She listened to everyone else's stories and soaked them in. She made everyone feel really heard, and she also learned how to end this crisis. She worked really hard to learn the policy and really hard to learn the organizing skills needed to build a movement. So she ended up with Everytown staff and worked with us on our partnerships team for a bit. And then she left because she decided to run for office. And in 2018, she won. So Lucy, who I had known first as a volunteer and an amazing volunteer who changed my life by telling her story, ended up as a member of Congress who is just like a piece of my heart forever. So I say this to just say that respect your volunteers. If you are lucky enough to work with them, you never know what could happen. So they're incredible. Training. So I mentioned a bit of this earlier. So we train our volunteers pretty regularly, and we have regular trainings every month, and we try to make sure that anything our volunteers might come up against in the state, they're able to learn about via the programs that we offer. So that's pitching media, and we do a spokesperson training to help folks who are talking to media regularly. In a lot of places, the letters to the editor in the papers are still incredibly well read. So we do training specifically on how to write an LTE that will get placed, and how to send it to your paper. All of that sort of stuff that just increases your media footprint can be really helpful. And of course, to earlier questions, we also do trainings on social media best practices, and those are some of the most popular things we do. We have, particularly right now, as so many people are at home, a ton of volunteers are learning more about social media, and it's counterintuitive, but a lot of our most active volunteers on social media are retired. They're grandmothers that have signed up for a Twitter account and are using it to hold their lawmakers accountable. Feedback. So one of the really key things that I have learned in working with volunteers is that they have a lot to teach you. And an example of that is one of our volunteers in Virginia who lives in a rural area, and she's a fifth-generation farmer. She is a gun owner, and whenever I write anything, because while I grew up around guns, I live in a metropolitan area where there's not as many of them now where I am. I really want her take. I want a gut check from a volunteer who has a different life experience than I do before I put something out on that topic. So think about that sort of resource that you have to get feedback on the work that you do. And if there's people that have different life experiences than you do and are able to make your work better, that's always a great resource to use. So always try to find those people and make sure they use their time well. And then resources. So there's two things that Dawn dropped into the chat box. Thank you, Dawn. So the first is a communications tactics sheet that I've created with my team. This sheet is basically, and it might be a little different depending on your organization, but for us, this has been a really helpful way in teaching people within our organization the amount of time something takes. So I'm sure this happens to others too, where if you see anything in the news, someone in your organization says, we should do a press release about that, or worse, we should hold a press conference about that. So we talk a lot about the knee-jerk press conference and how that's actually not always the best tactic to take. So this sheet, and feel free to, of course, take it and adapt it to your own organization if it's helpful, goes through what the tactic is, when it's valuable, and the lift required to pull that tactic off, which of course will change based on where you're working. But hopefully that's helpful in thinking about the work that you're doing and what can come out of it. And then the last is the talking points template. So this is another document that my team uses at Everytown pretty regularly. So we used to have, the organization is only 7 years old, but we have a lot of documents. There have been a lot of stand your ground bills, a lot of permit with carry bills, a lot of background check bills, all sorts of things. And so this template has really helped us simplify the way we store information and also what we give our volunteers. So my goal when I give volunteers messaging is that it fits within this template in a really clean way. And you'll see that because I am very detail oriented, I also include a draft of what I think the document should be called, so that when you have an issue like mine where there's years and years of similar things, you're not confused when you look back to see which document is from which year and that sort of stuff. The main thing I want to point out about this document, though, is that we start all of our talking points with a version of the talking point that is just if you say one thing. So everything you want to say in an interview should be able to be boiled down into a sentence or two. It should be pithy, it should be quotable, it should be a line that you can actually imagine in a newsletter or on TV. So if it's on TV, that means it's under 7 seconds typically as a soundbite. So think about what is, if you're doing an interview or have someone doing an interview, what is the one thing you want them to hear out of that? So that's always where we start. And then we go into 3 to 5 things that will hopefully build out the interview, so the supporting points. So of course, there might be key facts that you want people to include as they're talking about a topic. The better thing is analogies and stories. Those are always more quotable. So when we do interviews, we tell volunteers that if they're talking about an issue, they should know like 2 to 3 stats well that are related to that. But otherwise, it's about their own experience. And it's about the stories that that make the experience feel really concrete to people. So we try to elevate those too. And finally, each other is a great resource, and this community is a great resource. So I think I'm talking to some of y'all hopefully again tomorrow for another Zoom session that's a bit more casual, and happy to keep answering questions, of course, too.
Great, thank you so much. That was fantastic. Okay, we have some questions. Where is the chat box? They're both questions about the chat box. Okay, so on the panel, if you click the caret, it should drop down and you should be able to see the 2 links. If not, I will make sure to email it to everybody on this session and you can download it later. They're great resources, Mark and Jennifer. You're missing out on a lot. Sorry. Hopefully you can find them. Is there any questions about the presentation or anything with Taylor before we're let her free and go back to all of her great work? You can also raise your hand. I saw somebody raise their hand. I'm so excited. Okay. Anna, you're going to be up. I'm about to unmute you. You're unmuted.
Hi, thanks. Hi, Taylor. Thanks for this great presentation. I'm a small communications team of one, which means I wear a lot of hats. So like this morning, I was troubleshooting some coding issues on our website, and I'm also responsible for pitching to media, which has never been a huge part of my capacity because I do a lot of things. But it's something our executive director is really wanting to see us do more of. And so I kind of have like a two-part question, and you can answer both or whichever one you are feeling inspired to answer. But one, how can I best maximize the fact that this is such a small, like maybe 5-10% of my FTE? Or what are some good talking points that I can send back to my executive director when she pushes for more of this to help her see why we need to invest more capacity and financial resources into this area of our communications work?
This is a great question, and I will answer both parts. So on the first part, with this being such a limited part of your portfolio, and it sounds like you have a huge job, I would really invest in relationships, which takes more time up front, but then gets you a lot more quickly. So I would make a list of like the top 5-10 outlets that matter most for the issue that you work on, and make a goal of meeting someone at those outlets if you can over the next, like, I don't know, few months, year, whatever makes sense with your portfolio. But if you have that limited time, the thing that will matter most is people actually getting back to you and you're not having to chase them. So I would suggest really investing in the relationship side. On messaging to your executive director. So the communications tactics sheet should actually be helpful in that, because that goes through how much of a lift everything in comms is. Comms is an issue where I think people who aren't in communications often think that anyone can do it because it's just like writing things and sending things. But obviously we know that there's a lot more strategy to it than that. And so hopefully that tactics doc is helpful in explaining some of the strategy behind the work that we do and the level of detail that it takes to actually get it through.
Okie dokie. Got a question from Joe. How about deciding on the newsworthiness of a story?
Is that the newsiness?
Newsworthiness.
Newsworthiness. Yeah, that's a great question too. There is a few factors I would consider. So first of all, does it relate to anything that's currently in the news? Are there beats coming up naturally in the calendar? So for example, right now I have a few things that I'm working on that I'm holding because they relate to Mother's Day. Do they relate to a larger theme? And if not, that's also fine if it's strange or if it's surprising. So if it doesn't relate to something that's like a big thing people are working on, I would think about what I learned actually from doing a lot of improv previously in life is find the weird thing and pitch that. So think about what you're pitching, figure out like what is unusual in this room, what is like making this pitch stand out to me. And that should probably be the headline of the story if you're able to get it written.
Perfect. Great. Thank you. Mario has a question of what are some of your favorite brands or individuals that serve as a good example for communication strategies, engagement, etc.?
Well, obviously my own. I do think Shannon Watts, the founder of Moms Demand Action, is the fastest person on Twitter. So if you want to see someone who just is on it at all times and always pithy, I would recommend her feed by far. It's a good question. I really value like Aminatu So. I think she's an incredibly interesting voice and often says things I haven't thought about yet, and I really like seeing what she has to say. And she's also pretty entrepreneurial. I will think about this more. I don't have a ton of examples off the top of my head.
That's okay. It's always hard. Yeah. Always, yeah. Later you're like, oh my gosh, I love this person. How
I
did I not
know.
mention them?
I know. Well, I do like I take in so much media on a daily basis. I really value. I mean, but honestly, what I'm looking at mostly is what reporters are doing. I do think that Supermajority is doing a really good job on social. They are doing interesting, relevant things right now. They just did a over Zoom, I think, conversation series with Cecile Richards and Refinery 29. So I think like any organization that's getting a media partner right now is probably doing it pretty well. But yeah, it's tough to think of names on the spot for me.
I know. I have a question. So,
Sure.
how do you get reporters' contact information, their emails, or do you really use, social media?
So so there's like a few ways, and it depends on the outlet. So for outlets that I work with a lot, I have all of the like how the emails are structured memorized, basically. So
Wow,
when it's
okay.
like first initial, last name, first name period, last name, like depending on the outlet, you can generally guess the email. It's typically like it's typically pretty easy to guess, unless they're super high profile, and then it might be slightly different. I do check Twitter and see if it's in their bios, and obviously, if you work at an organization that's large enough, you might have vision too. But I think for a lot of the pitching media that's not national, the best thing is always reaching out to assignment desks for local TV, and that is all accessible on their own website. So I'll often go to their own websites to find out what we should be talking about.
Great. Yeah, I use the sneaky spy way of just finding out what the formula is for their email and then emailing people. That's usually how I invite most speakers for Create Good, honestly, because it's kind of hard to find like, upper level, director level people, or you get the news at, everytown.org
Yeah.
or something like that. So
Yeah, but
yeah,
for us,
I'll reverse organize, engineer stuff a lot.
yeah, and it's a good way to do it. And I also say like for local outlets, they do still sometimes include the reporter's email and phone number at the bottom of the piece. And so that can be a good resource too. But I think it definitely depends on the type of outreach you're trying to do.
Yeah. And I think what's been interesting for me about your presentation, and it's something that has always been true about PR, is it's about relationships. And it's about people knowing when you email that you're have credibility and you're trustworthy, and that, yeah, sure, it's about having people's information, but it's also about having that relationship. And that's only built through doing good work over time.
Yeah, and it's also hard because from a lot of the questions, it's clear that I'm not the only one that feels pretty overwhelmed with work.
Yeah.
And it is really difficult to make the time to do relationship building and remember to like reach back out and take the time to. I mean, I am a relatively introverted human. For me, asking a reporter to get coffee is like a 5-day process of like getting myself up to it. But it's really important, right? Like that's actually how you get this work done well, is to build those relationships. And honestly, I've sometimes bonded with reporters over the fact that it like takes forever to actually do that. So reporters are anxious people too.
Exactly. I know. I think we should do a hands raise if you have if you're also an introvert and it's the most terrifying thing is to ask questions.
Yes. Well, there'll be a separate Zoom for introverts and communications later, I'm sure.
Exactly. Okay, so Claire has a question. Okay, so how about how many folks are involved in writing a talking point document like you modeled? So at our organization, tons of people want to weigh in and wordsmith, which sometimes results in us missing key timeline windows. Advice on how to streamline this without leadership feeling like they're being left out.
Yes, I do. I've been through this a lot. So 2 things I would say. So the Management Center has a lot of really good resources online. So at Everytown, what we do, because we also have a ton of people who want to approve everything, is that for any project, we have a MOCA, which is an acronym for manager, owner, consultant, helper, approver. And we define in advance of a project who falls into which of those buckets. So we know who is approving this, who is actually managing the work, who's doing the work. And that helps just to have that clarity. People who are senior but maybe tangential to a project know that yes, they get to consult on this or they get to help with it, but they are not the final approver of this project. The other thing that we have started to do is when we send something around for approval, we'll be really clear in like 3 bullet points of what it is and the timeline. So we'll say, this is talking points about the intersection between gun violence and coronavirus in communities of color. We need this by 11 a.m. today. Reviewers are, and then because we use Slack, we tag everyone who we need to review that. And that tends to work when we're clear about who is actually needing to look at this. And for us in Slack, like there might be other people in the channel where we're dropping that so they can do it, but they know that they're not being asked to approve that document. And just like that clarity of comms owning the process and saying like, this is the deadline, we are getting it out after this point if you don't approve it, which realistically we're not going to do, right? Like we're not actually going to send something out into the world before it's fully approved. But if you give people that timeline, then it tends to help in holding folks accountable and being able to say later, hey, like what can we do better to make sure that you can meet this deadline that we need to be meeting.
That's awesome. I really love the MOCA process. That is really cool. I think it's so good to establish that early in the process that, yeah, who gets what say, level of say. Can you repeat what the acronym stands for?
Yes. Yeah, I love it too. So MOCA, M is the manager. So that's the person that is actually responsible for making sure the work is getting done. O is the owner. So that is one person that is owning, like, not necessarily one person, but those are the people that are actually doing the work and bringing all the pieces together for the manager's approval. C is consultant. So those are folks whose buy-in you need on a project, people that you want to have a look, make sure they're okay with the concept, but don't need to be approving everything. Helpers are probably people on the teams of the consultant. So if you have a big organization like I do, the consultants are often department directors and the helpers are often people in those departments who might need to contribute to the project. And then A is approver, and that's always one person, and that is typically the boss of the manager, and that's the person that will be final approver on that going out the door.
That's really great. That's really cool. That's a great tool. That's really neat. Okay, we have a question from Madeline, and she asks, our organization focuses entirely on individuals with intellectual disabilities. While we thoroughly train them to act as spokespeople for our organization, do you have any recommendations for prepping reporters to review somebody who has more sensitive interview targets? So yeah, do you preface those relationships, for reporters at all?
Yes, I do. I've done that before. So the related experience I would add to that is working with gun violence survivors, who some of whom are can really talk about something traumatic and it doesn't affect them in a really traumatizing way. They're not re-traumatized by telling their story. For others, when they tell their story, they're reliving it every time, and we have to be really sensitive to that in the expectations we set with media. So I think what I would suggest, and again, it depends on the relationships you have, but if it's possible, I would just set ground rules in advance. I would typically start that process with a phone call and just off the record wanted to talk to you about the person that you're interviewing, and I know their voice is really important to this, but I want to walk you through how I think we can make this process comfortable and get you what you need, and then give them those guidelines. So for us, we will often ask people if it's comfortable if they take a break every few minutes, for example. So if it's not a live television shot, then sometimes you're able to ask a reporter if after telling their story, a survivor can take a minute and then come back to the interview, and that sort of thing helps. But there's probably similar things in what you do where there might be pieces of your work that are just like adjustments that you could ask a reporter to make that wouldn't affect what the story turns into, but would make it a lot more comfortable experience for the people you work with.
Yeah, I think it's great. And I think it's always good to remember that reporters are real people, right? And they don't want to re-traumatize people. They don't want to make anybody look, I mean, unless it's, with elected officials, they don't want to make anybody look dumb. So,
yeah.
Or feel bad about the interview. So, okay. Joanna has a question. She says, how do you get reluctant coworkers or organizational volunteers to be willing to talk to media when you know that they are the best spokespeople for your organization?
I still struggle with this. So I think the first thing to do is to ask people, like what their comfort zone is, and to understand before you go to someone and say, hey, I really want you to do this interview, have a conversation with them and say, I think that your voice is really important. What are the types of things that are you comfortable talking about publicly, if anything? The other thing I would do is really practice. So if you have an interview coming up in a few days, or that you want that person to do, we do a lot of just like recording on phones and doing pre-interviews where we totally practice what we think the reporter will ask and then give feedback. You can even do that before someone has said yes to doing an interview. You can say, you know what, I know that you are not comfortable doing interviews. I still want you to be media trained in case you ever change your mind. And sometimes that process of just doing the media training, of going through a practice interview and getting a lot of positive feedback from it, can be enough to give people the confidence to be willing to use their voice publicly.
That's great advice. Yeah. It's all about relationships. That's what came out of
Always
all
is.
this. Well, thank you so much. I just wanted to give you a little bit of feedback. Mark says thank you. Anna says that the document is hugely helpful, and that Anna is also an introvert. She shared that. So, Stephanie says great presentation. So thank you so much. That's all we have time for questions. Can people reach out to you directly with any further questions that they have?
Yes, that's my next slide, and I forgot it. There you go. Yes, that is my email. That's my Twitter. That's LinkedIn. Find me on all the things. And happy to answer any questions.
Great. Everybody's saying thank you, thank you, thank you. So thank you so much for joining us for the session. Thank you for everybody for listening in, and have a productive rest of your day. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.